This is a Hobbit Silmarillion crossover podfic of the fic. No, we are not doing that by Solitary Bird. Read for you by Solitary Bird. This fic is rated T. Thorin throws Bilbo off the side of the mountain, only for Bilbo to fall on top of an elf about to say something he may come to regret later. Author's note, just a silly brain thought I have been holding on to for a long time. Cold wind whistles along the side of the mountain, bringing with it the scent of a burning dale. Bilbo's heart hammers in a chest that very suddenly feels too tight to house it. Around him the dwarves are arguing, trying to reason with an enraged Thorin, but Bilbo can't hear their words at all. Maybe it's the wind blowing away the sound before it can make its way to his ears. Dangled as he is over the edge of the balcony, Bilbo thinks it's more likely that his mind is fixated on the subtle movements of Thorin's face, desperate to find any sign of the dwarf he's grown so affectionate of in the stranger's face. The Thorin he knows wears no crown, no finery at all besides a few plain-looking silver rings and the beads in his short beard. This Thorin standing before him now is covered in gold, and still hungers for more of it, like the metal has taken over his mind. Even Philly and Killy have noticed a change in their uncle. But any action now is too late. The paranoia of their king has him holding Bilbo over the edge of the mountain, threatening to drop him to what would have been his certain death. Bilbo can't even beg him for his life. Thorin's face may as well be carved of stone, and the hand around Bilbo's throat is unyielding. He can barely breathe. The other members of the company turn horrified faces to Thorin as he speaks the words of Bilbo's banishment from Erebor. Dwalin is the first to realise that Thorin's threat is more than a threat, that the gold sickness runs deeper than he'd feared. The realisation comes only seconds before the king's fingers loosen, and Bilbo plummets over the edge. Time seems to dilate in an almost comical fashion as the hobbit sees Thorin tackled to the ground and the ghost of Dwalin's fingers pass over his own cheek. Just a little too late. But Bilbo wouldn't blame him. He hadn't truly thought that Thorin would do this either. Someone was screaming. It seemed impossibly loud, only to fall into nothingness as Bilbo's descent hastened. Eagles coming to save him for a second time seemed like the sort of fanciful thought that a hobbit plunging his way to a rather painful and decidedly messy death could be forgiven for having. Only Bilbo isn't dashed to pieces on the craggy sides of the lonely mountain. Instead, he falls on top of someone. At first he thought it to be Gandalf, and was almost ready to forgive him for his sudden disappearance yet again. Gandalf is entirely the sort of person who was underfoot only when you least wanted him, or most needed him. Sometimes the two intersected, until someone rather rudely grabbed him by the back of his shirt and lifted him clear off of the floor. "I'm terribly sorry," Bilbo said once he'd been placed back on his feet, and was able to see the hissing red-headed elf he'd knocked to the ground. There were murmurs around him, and Bilbo turned to see a gathered crowd of elves surrounding them. They looked nothing like the elves he had seen in Mirkwood. Silver-haired and pale-skinned they were not, more in looks like some he had seen in Rivendell when Bilbo came to think about it. They must have come a long way. He'd found the elves in Rivendell to be considerably more rational than Thranduil's, so he hoped that they might be able to talk some sense into the Elven King, and maybe even Thorin too, come to think of it. He couldn't just punt members of the company off the edge of his kingdom at the drop of a hat. That was the sure-fly way to find yourself in the same position when the people realised that they could throw you. There was a niggling itch at the back of his head that something wasn't quite right, but Bilbo was too much of a Baggins, too much of a hobbit, not to give his most formal of spoken apologies. He then made an effort to turn on the hosting skills he'd gained from countless parties full of rowdy tucks and months on the road, with a load of dwarves he'd really not like to think about at the moment. "Begging your pardon for the intrusion," he stammered, reaching a hand out to the dark-haired elf he'd landed on, who was still sprawled on the floor. "Wasn't my intention to fall off the side of the mountain this morning, I can assure you, but I'm awfully glad that you were there to stop me from dying." The elf is just staring at him in dazed shock, his fingers twitching in a way that makes Bilbo worried he's caused him a serious brain injury, until a red-haired elf, impossibly tall, pushes his way to the front of the crowd that Bilbo is only just realising is gathered around them. Atta! Several other elves are elbowing their way through the crowd, and help the red-haired one prop his father up. They speak together in a tight knot of concerned voices. occasionally turning back to look at Bilbo in confusion and a little fear. Bilbo tries to listen in so that he can best construct a more in-depth apology. Maybe ask them if they know where Gandalf is, and if they do, ask to be taken to him. Maybe that way he'll be able to avert the worst of what Thorin's gold sickness is about to do. Maybe this hobbit will be able to save a few lives. Gandalf would likely have a plan to deal with the gold sickness. Bilbo won't let himself think otherwise. Of course Gandalf will know what to do, but it's dark. Only the stars and various flaming torches light the gathering. Every uplit face is terrified, though, incredibly disproportionately terrified, and there is a distinct lack of a full moon in the sky. That's what clues Bilbo that something is incredibly wrong. The elves aren't speaking Sindarin, at least not the type of Sindarin his mother taught him, and that's very odd too. Bilbo's going to add that to the quickly increasing pile of red flags he's gathering. The elf he'd almost flattened seems to have rallied himself and picks up a sword that Bilbo is apparently very lucky to have not been split in half by during his fall, and holds it aloft in the air. Be he friend or foe or foul offspring of Morgoth Bauglir. Bilbo kicks Fëanor in the shins. He knows the speech. He'd read it before in a history book. These were the words that had started the beginning of the bloodiest, most cursed age of Middle-earth, and doomed so many to unhappy ends. No, we're not doing that, he shouted, as utter chaos ensues. Someone picked him up off the ground again, an act he was entirely unimpressed with, and made known to all and sundry. It turns out that not even the Valar know what a hobbit is. Bilbo's own people hadn't featured in the histories of the world beyond the odd mention in a ranger's dispatch, and even the oldest hobbit still living when Bilbo himself had been a child knew not when or where hobbits had come from. Apparently hobbits didn't exist yet in this time. Putting aside the fact that this wasn't the Third Age, nor was he at the foot of Erebor's slopes, was difficult. He'd already changed something. The Noldor was supposed to be rallied by Fëanor's wrath against Morgoth, and it would end with the Fëanorians marching off into the artificial night and sailing off in the blood-soaked boats of their kin. Bilbo knows enough history to know that this right now is a crucial point in that history, a place where the fate of the world changes forever, and one the Valar are clueless about how to deal with. Fëanor is a raging fire. They are knowingly, or possibly unknowingly, pouring oil on. Looking at him right now as his sons protectively form a ring around him, he'd never know his death is only a short time away from him, on the shores of a foreign land consumed in flames. In Bilbo's eyes, the lad, because in elven eyes Fëanor is still remarkably young, is terrified. The whites of his eyes dwarf the dark rings of his irises, like a pony trapped in a burning stable by its fear alone. Fëanor is attempting to flee his sensed entrapment by the Valar, who should really know better than to trap someone so scared in a corner. They should also not be making demands of someone that had become an orphan under their lax watch and statistically proven false promises. Fëanor is an easy target, an easy entity for everyone to idiotically place the blame for their own toxic behaviour. Bilbo's not having it. If this isn't some fever dream of his dying mind, and he has somehow travelled through time and space to find himself able to do something about the mess of the First Age, then he's going to do something about it, if he can. If one hobbit can do enough to change the course of history, Bilbo wiggles out of the tight hold of a very persistent elf and marches up to the towering entity that you can only assume is Lord Manwë, and he stomps his foot on the ground. Everyone turns to look at him once more as Bilbo also places his hands on his hips for good measure, a power move he'd seen his ma employ many a time when she was about to lecture someone on their bad behaviour. He starts struggling with the awkward ways Quenya pulls at the shape of his mouth and placement of his tongue. The Aenir have terrible interpersonal skills. I'm not even going to bring up the entire bungling mess you made of the House of Finwë. No dishonour meant to you. Bilbo bows in the direction of Fëanor and his sons, but also to his half-brothers and their children too. Everyone seems entirely too shocked to do anything but stare as Bilbo dresses down a collection of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth. Bilbo begins counting out their transgressions on his fingers, telling a grieving lad his ma isn't ever coming back when everyone else's can and will, not providing appropriate support for his mental health, changing the rules for Finwë, playing favourites, letting your own brother do as he likes without consequences, spoiling him, and yet condemning everyone else to making a promise in a moment of haste and grief and anger, when even a hobbit such as I knows that contracts such as that should require a cool-down clause. so that in the sober light of day, when they realize what they've actually done, they can walk back without bloodshed. No one is swearing an oath today, no one is going to Aqualunde to sail over the sea after the murderer, nor are you trekking over the grinding ice. Not one more elf will die. No, not even to fulfill the were-guild for the High King. The cost of doing so, it will be the utter annihilation of the House of Finwë, the death and enslavement of thousands, and blood staining all of your hands. There are shocked gasps at his declaration, but Bilbo pushes onwards. Let the Aenua deal with the Aenua. Let them do something, anything, to save all 3 ages of torment. A flash of lightning cracks through the dark expanse of the sky, burying itself in Bilbo's chest. Before the boom of thunder even begins rumbling, Bilbo's vision goes black. He's falling again, but only briefly, before he hits the ground and passes out. When he wakes, it's in Thorin's arms. The end. Thank you for listening.